Good morning, everyone. We'll give everyone a few seconds to hop on and then we'll get started. All right, looks like we have a good group growing. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. I'm Samantha Miller, and I'd like to thank you for joining on Zoom today and for your partnership in the Research America Alliance. Before we get started, just a little administrative housekeeping. If your organization is not a member, I hope you'll shoot Joel, our Director of Membership, an email to discuss the work of our Alliance and how much we'd value your involvement. His email is in the chat now. Please also remember to type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll pose as many as we can during the Q&A portion of today's discussion. Today, I am pleased to say that we are joined by Dr. Mitch Prinstein, Chief Science Officer at the American Psychological Association. Dr. Prinstein is here today to discuss insights from APA's recent health advisory on social media use in adolescence and what current research is telling us about how social media is affecting our youth. This is a particularly important and timely topic as kids are getting back into school, so I hope you're all as excited for the discussion as I am. We'll start today with a brief presentation from Dr. Prinstein, and then we'll get into our Q&A. So with that, I will say welcome, Dr. Prinstein, and thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. Thanks so much for inviting me. And I am happy to spend about 20 minutes telling you a little bit about some of the research in this area and the ways that research is having an impact on policy. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So please do feel free to go ahead and list whatever questions you have. What I'll do today is I'm going to give you a quick primer on the human brain. For some of you, this will be very much a review, and for some of you, it will be brand new. I'll tell you a little bit about the emerging science on how social media might be related to adolescent brain and psychological development. And then I'm going to go ahead and tell you about the APA Health Advisory. So let me start by going back just a little bit, 60,000 years ago or so, to remind you that we were not the only human-like species on the planet back then. There were actually several other species that had full capacity to survive. In fact, most would have bet on them, not us, to have made it this far because they were bigger, they were stronger, they were hardier, they could withstand longer periods of severe temperature or hunger. But there was one thing that we had that they didn't, and it seems that that might have been the piece that made all the difference. It was a small genetic mutation that changed the shape of our voice box, allowing us to grunt in progressively sophisticated more ways, and commensurate change in the brain that allowed us to understand this as language. Well, language allowed us to become a herding species, and that social connection became a primary advantage in what it is that we are doing now, today, even 60,000 years later, that's remarkably important for this conversation and so many of the conversations that we have about psychology and social connection and mental health as well. So there's been some research to show that even though it is tens of thousands of years later, there are still remarkably enduring effects of that social sensitivity that is the hallmark of our species. For instance, some really interesting research that was done by Naomi Eisenberger and others in the field using a very simplistic kind of mock game where it seems that you, while you're laying in a brain scanner, an fMRI, are passing a ball between two other folks that you believe are also research participants until all of a sudden at one point, they start passing the ball only to themselves, leaving you out, leaving you excluded. Well, the research demonstrates that at that moment, your brain shows activation surprisingly in the same areas where you see physical pain responses. I don't mean the parts of the brain that are part of the sensory cortex that make us feel a burning or a tingling that we would say, ouch, but the part of the brain that also gets activated when we feel physical pain, which tells us, warning, whatever you're doing, do the exact opposite right now. This is important for your survival. And it's those areas that seem to be activated when we experience social pain. In fact, the overlap between physical and social pain is so strong, there's some evidence that taking a Tylenol helps us after a breakup, helps us emotionally feel better. really suggesting that this social sensitivity and this need to belong is so incredibly powerful that it's sending such important alarm signals within our neural networks. There's also now evidence that within every single cell of our body, we have DNA, dormant DNA, that's being expressed and newly activated with upregulation and pro-inflammatory response just 40 minutes after a rejection experience, including even a simulated rejection experience in a research lab, and downregulation of our viral immunity within just minutes of a social rejection response. The inflammation response may have made sense back then, because if you were out of the herd, you might get injured. You needed your blood to clot, ward off a bacterial infection. And as we all know from the last few years, to conserve energy, if you're not around people, you can't catch a virus. So we see the downregulation of our viral immunity. Today, none of this is really necessary, except that we now have inflammation as one of the biggest areas of disease and mortality in our species. Well, all of this is very important because we have changed our social environment remarkably so in just about 20 years. So after 60,000 years of us co-evolving with our environment to create a beautiful match between what it is that we do in our social lives and how it is that our brain develops and responds to our social environment, we now have changed all of that. Now, of course, I don't want to be kind of sounding like a person that's totally against technology or anything like that. We've had many different ways in which our social context has changed before, going back to the printing press, which fundamentally changed our communication, to the telephone, to email, to instant message. But what researchers are demonstrating is that there's something about social media that seems to have changed many different aspects of our social environment all simultaneously. So this is something that's worth at least a look and some research attention so we can understand how it is this may be playing a role. As you know, we can now communicate with others in asynchronous ways. What we say is a matter of permanent record for the entire world's wide web to see. We're expected to be available at all times to respond to posts, especially among young people who pressure one another, surprisingly, to respond to their posts immediately. We're only getting a few cues. We've kind of dumbed down the sophisticated network of nonverbal and verbal cues that we're so good at interpreting. And now we just have a thumb pointing up or not as our way of communicating more complex social messages. And we actually quantify each other's social context so we can see how much each other is getting attention or is visible, or any particular utterance or post might be getting that. This is a medium that focuses on visual cues. We didn't used to walk around in the 80s holding up pictures of ourselves and asking people to tell us if we were hot or not. But now this is a medium that allows us to, really focus more on visual things. But perhaps most importantly, we now have outsourced some of our social decision making to computers. For the first time in the history of our species, who we befriend, in what order we see their posts, how we're reminded and to talk to whom, is being at least coached, if not in some cases more fully dictated by artificial intelligence. So we're here to talk about adolescence, and I want to tell you just a little bit about how all of this becomes especially relevant for that age when kids are most likely to first get access, unfettered or unsupervised access to technology. The adolescent brain is developing at puberty, as I'm sure you know, but what most people don't realize is that it's actually a year or two before we see physical signs of puberty outside the body, where the brain has already started its development. And it develops one region at a time, usually from the, from the back to the front, and from the more primitive regions to later the more human regions that sit on top, the cerebral cortex. So we're really seeing that very first area of brain development that's happening around 10 or 11 is that there's this proliferation of receptors for oxytocin and dopamine. And what that means is that we're suddenly motivated to really be focused on social bonding and social connections and reinforcement among peers in particular. And when we do, it feels really, really good. Now, that's related to a variety of other brain regions that changes our actual behavior as a response to social reinforcement. But anyone who's ever been 11 or 12 or a parent of an 11 or 12-year-old knows that this is when kids start rolling their eyes at their parents. They're focused on anything and everything that their peers are doing. And they're very sensitive to that feedback from peers. We even see that in other mammals as well. Mice prefer to hang out with other pubertal mice during their pubertal development and not adults anymore. But the part of the brain that is our inhibition center that keeps us from pursuing every impulse that might help us to feel good or feel reinforced, that's the prefrontal cortex. And that area of self-control doesn't fully develop until the age of 25. This period of brain reformulation and reorganization from 10 to 25 is extraordinarily important, perhaps the second most important time of brain development after the first year of life. And this is the critical time when kids are receiving, getting access to, and being courted to spend as much time as possible on social media platforms and technology. So we just have to think about how to help them, given that they have a different brain than the adults that social media platforms have been designed for. So when we talk about social media, it's really important to recognize that social media is not a homogeneous experience. It is the combination of what content people choose to look at or choose to post, plus the things that are built right into the platforms, which might include the opportunity for likes or followers or things like that. And then plus the component of artificial intelligence. So sometimes outside of scientific circles, this conversation can start to sound a little overly simplistic. From a scientific perspective, it's important to remember that we're talking about a few different things when we use a phrase like social media. People sometimes also are really striving for a really quick fix or just kind of a one age cutoff to say that, on the night you go to sleep, the last day you're 15, everything is risky. But when you wake up the next day and you're 16, nothing will be risky, everything will be safe. Of course, remember scientifically that adolescent development is actually very gradual and continuous, and there's quite a lot of individual variability. Some kids may be prepared and developed at 10 to be exposed to this content, these functions, and this AI, and others may not be until they're 30. We should understand that racism and bias are built into the platforms themselves because most of the coding, of course, has been done by humans making choices and decisions. So whatever systemic oppression or biases that we see in society are likely also reflected in the ways that these platforms have been put together. And it's important to remember, too, that for ethical reasons, we can't force some kids onto social media and other kids make them abstain and then see how they grow up or their brains develop differently. So we don't have randomized controlled trial data in most all cases, but the conclusions, therefore, that are being made in this data set and these studies and this literature are largely based on temporal associations using prospective longitudinal. The same way that we think about the effects of combat on PTSD or maltreatment on mental health, but nevertheless, it's important to recognize that caveat. Scientists are not saying is social media all good or all bad. That's not the right question. The right question I might propose is under which conditions and for which children might there be specific features or specific content on social media that might be helpful or might be harmful to development overall. So just to get a little bit more specific for a research audience, I can tell you that the literature in this area has been broken out into at least 9 different sub-questions. I'm not going to have time to go over all of these right now, but I did want to highlight just a few, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what's starting to be understood using some longitudinal studies and looking at some rigorous science in this area. First, I'll talk a little bit about potential benefits of social media use, talk a little bit about the ways that social media might enhance peer influence processes, how every minute on social media is taking away an opportunity to do something else and why that might be important. What people talk about with problematic social media use, colloquially, people talk about this as addiction, but scientists use a different phrase, and also how social media might be related to brain development. So diving right in, I wanted to mention that it would be wrong and short-sighted for us to take away social media from all children for many, many years, because the research clearly demonstrates that especially for members of underrepresented or marginalized communities, the opportunity to process minority stress, find out helpful, accurate medical information, or to simply connect with others that have the same identity online provides important sources of social support. For many kids, there's no one in their school or perhaps in their family that shares the same identity. So It's important that they have the opportunity, and research says that in some cases, the presence of online-only friends, friends that they have online that they know they'll never meet in public in real life, can actually buffer the effects of stress and prevent serious outcomes like suicidal behavior. We know that social media provided important sources of companionship during COVID, and there's also greater diversity among our online peer contacts than among our offline peer contacts, which are usually offline, restricted to our community, our school, which is based on still somewhat segregated neighborhood sorting. We know that adolescents report that they enjoy their online interactions. We don't let teens do everything they enjoy, I understand, but for what it's worth, it's creating some subjective happiness for them. And we do know that the online community promotes civic engagement and activism in ways that have actually shaped our society in a very important fashion. There's some research that suggests that there's something about the online context, though, that also has the potential to influence peers, and especially at young ages, in either good ways, if they're being exposed to pro-social and adaptive attitudes, unfortunately, more often in maladaptive ways by encouraging them to engage in risk behavior for health risks or dangerous or illegal behavior. And the way that this works is based on just very simple psychological theories that you probably know about already, which is our tendency to overgeneralize from what we see and to engage in a process called pluralistic ignorance, which just means that when other people are doing the same thing as us, we might still think that we're the only ones that are feeling a certain way while everyone else is feeling a different way. So what I mean by that is that imagine that you looked online and you saw that somebody posted something, or there was an article and there were 20 comments on there. And those 20 comments indicated a point of view that you absolutely disagreed with. Well, you would have a choice. You could say, wow, of the entire readership of this outlet, there are 20 people who have quite unique points of view, which we rarely conclude, or instead say, wow, those 20 people probably represent like half of America. And I can't believe that there's so many people that have such wildly, radical viewpoints. And it's that latter overgeneralization that's very natural and healthy for us, but social media makes it almost too easy to make those kinds of generalized assumptions. It's the same happens when we see likes on a post. If we see a lot of likes, we might say, well, they liked it because they felt pressured to do it, or like, and which is the reason why I'm liking the post. Or they liked it because they really truly believe everything that that post conveyed. Well, for young kids, that's the problem as well. In ninth grade, researchers looked at the extent to which ninth graders saw posts related to drinking, and drinking a lot. Heavy episodic drinking is 5 or more alcoholic drinks on a single occasion. And when kids saw that post, they might have liked it too, but mostly it made them think, gee, everyone else must think it's a really good idea when you're only 13 to drink 5 or more drinks in just an hour or two. So the more they saw those posts and likes, the more they started to believe that their peers felt that way. And the more they felt that they believed that, the more likely they were to initiate 5 or more drinks in ninth grade themselves. A really elegant way of demonstrating this relationship between what we see, what we think, and how it changes our actual offline behavior. Of course, you've probably heard by now that one of the things the kids are not doing because they're on social media is they're not getting sleep. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine recommends 8 to 9 hours of sleep for adolescents, and only 40% of ninth graders get that. Only 20-some percent of 12th graders get that at all. The reason why, 90% of studies demonstrate that it's because of screen time. It's the number one reason why it is that kids are not getting as much sleep as they should. And it's not just screen time for homework, it's specifically the social media apps. Well, this is important because research is demonstrating that the more sleep disruptions kids have, or the less sleep they're getting, the smaller their brain's size over time. Remember, this is an important time of brain growth. Also, their brain is starting to function in different and aberrant ways. So if screens are making your kids not sleep, then that sleep is changing how their brain grows. Is social media addictive? We don't use the word addiction in the scientific community. We talk about problematic social media use, but we do use the actual criteria for substance use addiction to assess these questions. straight from the diagnostic manual for things like cocaine addiction, but now using the word social media. Researchers ask kids whether they're spending more time on social media than they want, whether they try and spend time away, but they can't, whether they take extra effort to make sure they still have access to their devices, and if they crave or desire strongly to use social media, if it gets in the way of their daily routines, if they can't stop even when they know it's harming them, whether they've been away from it and missing it so much actually interferes with their activities, and frankly, whether they feel that they're addicted. Well, research in our lab demonstrates that nearly all adolescents, over 95%, report that they're spending more time than they intended. Half of adolescents report that being away from it, the missing it and craving it, is interfering with their daily activities. And 1/4 perceive that they are moderately or severely addicted to social media use. This is important because research is suggesting that this might affect the brain. In our studies, along with Dr. Eva Telzer in our lab at UNC Chapel Hill, we've had the opportunity to look at screen time use in 6th grade and then do brain scans from 7th, 8th, and 9th to actually look at how the brain is growing. And specifically, not here the size, but what areas of the brain are getting super sensitive or maybe not reactive enough. Well, the research generally demonstrated that the more that kids are picking up their phones, and the average amount of times that 6th graders were picking up their phones was 100 times a day. And this was according to what their phone told us. With many of them picking up their phones 400 to 500 times a day. Well, the more that happens, the more they're showing a very different brain growth, particularly in areas that indicate a hypersensitivity to social cues. So basically, these are kids that are now very much looking for lots and lots of peer reinforcement. Meanwhile, less development in that prefrontal cortex. So kind of a bad combination. They're craving more and more positive feedback from peers, and they don't have the brake pedal anymore, quite as strongly as others do, to stop themselves from pursuing that craving. Well, research like this and other research that's been coming out was accumulated enough to lead the American Psychological Association to put together an expert panel to recognize that we have enough science to at least indicate some warning signs, to at least demonstrate that we should probably be offering some guidance and advice to policymakers, to tech companies, to parents, and to kids themselves, as well as educators, to say, here's what we know so far. And based on what we know so far, there are some things you should just be keeping an eye out on, things that you should know about. Based on that information, we recommended that kids should use social media and tech if they're using the functions that promote healthy socializations. That might be the direct messaging feature or ways in which they're able to get access to helpful social support. The platforms themselves need to be tailored or designed to take note of the developmental capabilities of those who are using it. An 8-year-old should not have the exact same experience as an 80-year-old on these platforms. Even the screens that tell you that they've changed the privacy notices are written with such legal and mature language that it's not possible for a young user to understand even that simple kind of notification that comes up, but probably other pieces too. When we talk about monitoring uses, obviously parents can't look over their kids' shoulders, but to have conversations and help kids to know that parents are a safe place to ask questions and to really do this in a scaffolded way, where parents are curious and interested in asking kids to talk with them about it. Let's take down this content that actively teaches kids how to cut themselves or engage in anorexic behaviors, or at least create warnings based on the AI intelligence to flag those and review them and take them down as much as possible, as well as content that promotes cyber hate. Research demonstrates that even those who are not the victims of cyber hate are still suffering mental health consequences by simply observing others being targeted or other groups being targeted online. Routinely screens for signs of problematic use and make sure that kids are engaging in moderate use to keep them from experiencing those kinds of addictive behaviors. Make sure no one should be using social media after 9 o'clock, and everyone should be getting physical activity. Try and help, especially adolescent females who already live in a world with far too much focus on physical appearance, to not use social media for that reason, and to teach them explicitly about the tricks and the bots and the filters that are used and more often than not are making matters worse. We should absolutely have all kids demonstrate competency in understanding the traps, the pitfalls, and the problems before they get on. No one should be given the keys to a car and be allowed to just drive down the highway without a test and without demonstrating that they're competent before they do so. And the same applies for social media. We also could be providing more resources in the world because we desperately need more research on this topic. Many of the people who study this topic are getting snapped up with offers too great to refuse from tech companies themselves. So we really need a concerted effort in training a research workforce to study these topics and to be paid to do so within research settings. We also recommend, I mentioned that everyone should be learning about social media literacy. We have a sample curriculum, a sample outline of what a curriculum could look like. I'm happy for these slides to be shared, but really to make kids know that it's their job to assume that there may be inaccuracy or unrepresentative facts that are being put out there, like mis and disinformation, to understand the tactics that are used to trick all of us, not just the people that disagree with us, but all of us, to sometimes make mistakes and misunderstand or be misled by what we see online, to help them limit their overgeneralization and misestimation errors. I apologize for the slide problem there. To understand and self-monitor signs of addiction and learn how to use social media for good, because there are some ways to do that. To learn how to solve conflicts in appropriate ways, to not engage in social comparisons, to recognize structural racism and critique and stand up when people are being attacked for their identity, to how to find the accurate mental health information online and not be swayed towards information that has not been vetted by trained professionals, and to understand who can benefit from kids using social media. So kids recognize that there may be ways that their data are being used for profit and they should behave accordingly. So with that, let me stop. I have my email address here at APA as so you can contact me if you have questions that we can't get to here, or if anything we're doing at APA overlaps with things that you're doing in your groups, we'd be very excited to collaborate. And with that, let me stop so there's ample time to answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Prinstein. What valuable information, fantastic presentation, so much to dive into. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that came to mind while you were speaking for myself, and then I'll encourage our audience to make sure that you put your questions into the Q&A. So I want to talk a little bit more about the health advisory. We got a lot of questions pre-submitted from our audience about social media literacy and training. What strategies can be employed to effectively educate the youth to recognize and respond to misinformation, cyberbullying, and other problems online?
Well, every other product that we buy for our kids comes with an insert that is developed by the company that sells the product themselves to say, this is what we know could be risky about using our product in the bathtub, or if you use it the wrong way, or something like that. Similarly, it may be fair to ask the companies that produce some of these platforms to create some sort of warnings, information, educational materials to talk about how to use the product safely. That feels like at a bare minimum, right? Before even changing it to make it a safer product, at least explain the warnings. We now have enough to say there's a good reason to think that these might be concerning. So that's certainly one piece. Until that happens, we might need for others to really help fill in the gaps. So it would be great if teachers were able to really help give information directly to kids. We spend time teaching kids how to brush their teeth so they don't get a cavity. We give them the food pyramids. They know how to make healthy choices when it comes to their nutrition and their exercise. We now also live in a world where these online opportunities and platforms are a reality. This is the world that kids likely will live in for decades to come. So we need part of the school curriculum, a way to say, we know that there are some risks and we're going to teach every single child how to handle that. Ideally, the tech companies themselves could build in really cool, engaging ways of teaching and testing competence in avoiding some of these risks before they even let kids create a profile at all.
Excellent. Excellent. And kind of on along those lines, how do we strike that balance in while we're monitoring use for parents per se? How do we strike that balance of, autonomy with responsible use? Because it's such an important developmental stage, and as you were speaking to, so much is happened, so many benefits come from it. How do we strike that balance?
As with so many other areas, this is a scaffolding procedure, as we would say in psychology, where we really want to provide a lot of support at first and then slowly take down the supports when it seems like autonomy is possible. Unfortunately, a lot of us, I'm guilty too, look at this as something so foreign and so silly compared to what we grew up with, perfectly fine without it, that we sometimes make comments like, oh, I don't know why you spend so much time on there, or I can't believe how much. And what ends up happening accidentally is we send the message to kids that says, I don't think this is worth even talking about. I don't think that this is a good use of your time. And we're actually taking away an opportunity to provide structure. Instead, it might be a good idea to sit down with a 9-year-old who's just discovered YouTube and say, let's watch it together. I want you to tell me, why do you find this so fascinating? What does it mean that they have so many followers? Why is that of interest to you? And really provide a lot of opportunity to say, your online world, I care about. I want to experience it with you. I want to talk with you about it. I want to teach you about it. And then over time, I'm going to let you make more choices on your own, of course. But that's a kind of reversal from what we've been doing so far, which is more hand waving and saying, I don't know why they spend so much time on that thing.
Excellent. Well, we have questions flooding in right now, so I'm not going to take up any more time with my questions. I will ask my colleague Jacqueline to join us to pose a few from the audience.
Great. Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Dr. Prinstein, for this really important, valuable discussion. So one question, starting for the audience. Sorry, one moment. How can we... Oh, sorry, we already answered that one. As social media has been identified as a technology to enhance education, I'm interested in perspective on benefits and risks to social media and education for youth and how to mitigate the risks.
Yeah, we don't have that much data that I'm aware of yet of how social media is helping educational outcomes, but we do know that technology can be incredibly helpful in general for educational outcomes, all the way from very young ages when kids are using apps to learn how to read and to learn math and whatnot. Of course, what that means is that as we're starting to give devices to kindergartners, to help them with some of those educational apps, they may slip into access to social media before we even realize. So it just means that we need to have some conversations really early and help the school to understand the use of technology that allows kids to do their work without being able to toggle to those other apps, intermittently, or ideally to help schools realize that if they make deadlines at 11 p.m. or midnight, that means they're encouraging kids to be on their devices until 11 p.m. or midnight, which means that for every minute they're doing their homework, they're probably spending at least 1 or 2 also checking social media. So we need a policy change, not a policy, but a social norm change to say everyone should be off their devices after 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock or something, including schools and how they encourage use for educational purposes.
Great. Thank you so much. Next question. Our organization does parent outreach to support them in raising healthy kids. Are the APA advisories around parental involvement, parentheses, monitoring, coaching, and having conversations backed by research, or are they just intuitive best practices? Where can I find out more?
Sure. At apa.org, we have the health advisory. We have a few documents as well that we did to give parents some talking points to help them get started and to also boil down the advisory into just some quick, here's some things you can do right now. What we hope to do, and what's happened remarkably so, is that we've really started a different kind of conversation around this in a way that we've now seen happening about, the trade-offs and the ways in which we can think about developmentally tailoring the experience given the changing brain and psychological development of kids at this age. We just want parents, unfortunately, many of whom are like freaked out and scared and feeling guilty, to feel like there is a way to be involved in this conversation that doesn't create shame and that you can be efficacious in. Ideally, policymakers and tech companies will do the heavy lifting here, but we didn't want parents to feel like they're out, with nothing they can do yet. So we provided a few of those tip sheets on the APA website.
Great. Thank you so much. Next question. What are examples of social media platform functionality that would be more aligned with youth user needs? For example, the like function works well for adults, but not necessarily kids.
Yeah, it would be interesting to, think about scientific studies on social media without a like button and without AI. And just those two changes alone could dramatically affect the child experience, and maybe be more developmentally appropriate. So that would be really important to test and look at. Of course, there would need to be incentive to make sure that folks who are interested in doing what was best for kids' development, even if that meant that they might not generate a profit or have as much engagement as they want. So that's, of course, the rub. But I think that those would be important things to start with.
Thanks so much. Next question. Would you recommend introducing kids to social media rather than waiting for them to get into it, such that one could teach how to use social media safely before access happens on its own?
Yeah, there are many different platforms and many different ways of doing this. There are some gaming platforms that allow for text and chats. There's YouTube, which is a platform for content sharing, but it has followers and comments and posts and whatnot. And then you're really getting into some that are much more heavily focused on social networking, and things like that. So it's important to recognize these are all different. These all have different opportunities and potentially different risks as well. Perhaps the most important thing to start off with, though, is thinking about those young kids before they get on social media who are watching the adults in their environment, in their house, their teachers, and how they use social media. Young kids, before they even get on a platform, have pretty strong attitudes about if they want to be on there, what they think will happen on there, why they think it's important. And they're getting a lot of that from watching their parents. So it's really important for parents to monitor what they're saying and doing in front of their kids with regard to this, so they're helping their kids develop healthy attitudes.
Excellent. I'm going to jump in really quick. We have so many amazing questions, but we did have a question here regarding the opportunities and needs for future research. Can you go into a little bit more depth about where the field is going and what gaps need to be filled?
So much. We desperately need more research on underrepresented or marginalized populations, particularly within the LGBTQ plus populations. We need to understand what seems to be very important benefits that can come from some uses of social media, how we can preserve those and make sure those are not taken away by any policies. We need to understand more of what's happening with young kids. We need to look at interventions and see what kinds of trainings will buffer the effects. There's some of that research going on now. We need more. We need to be looking at the effects on the brain. I mean, what we see so far is a little scary, and we need lots more research to replicate and make sure that those findings are holding up.
Excellent. And we have another question here kind of on that topic. Is there research on the association between social media use and educational outcomes? Is there research to come? Is there anything out now?
I think so. I'm not familiar with a lot of research on educational outcomes other than what we know about tech in general, but how social media, how watching TikTok videos or, Instagram profiles might affect educational outcomes. I haven't seen a lot of that yet. If listeners know of any of that, please do feel free to send it to me. I'd be very interested.
And then I'll do one more and then I'll throw it back to Jacqueline. We have a question here about the topic that you were talking about, that the benefits of having an online community, particularly friends that you only know online. And this person is asking for a little bit more information about the idea that only online friends buffer the effects of stress on suicidal behavior. Can you go into a little bit more depth about that?
Yeah, that was actually a paper we did in our lab, and the first author was Massine Schaefer, and I'm one of the authors as well. And what we had found was that among kids who are experiencing peer victimization, the presence of an online-only friend was associated longitudinally with a lower likelihood of suicide attempts, even after controlling for their prior suicide attempts and their in real life friendships too. For some kids, their in real life friendships have higher friendship quality than their online friendships. But for other kids, especially those who might have some social anxiety or depression or otherwise have a hard time making friends, they're reporting that these online friendships are very high in quality, maybe even higher than the quality they have with their real life friendships. So, so we don't want to take all that away. That's offering some benefit.
Definitely. Definitely. All right. I'm going to ask Jacqueline for a little help here.
So I'll jump in. So many questions. The APA's advisory seemed to be squarely about social media. How much does it extend to other digital screen topics, like, say, playing video games or watching videos and shows?
Yeah, we were in fact intentionally focused on social media. Some gaming does have a social media component to it, so we have a definition about the way we define social media within the advisory to kind of show you where that we drew the circle around that. There are other literatures out there about games online, games and exposure to TV content that's not that's not has a social media component. That literature is a bit different, so we're not touching that in our advisory at all. Generally speaking, there's I believe that literature talks about folks that might have pre-existing vulnerabilities, might see those vulnerabilities a bit exacerbated depending on what content they're exposed to, but playing a violent video game among someone with no violent vulnerabilities in and of itself may not be related to any negative outcomes.
Thank you. And we just have
Sure.
time for one more question. I work for an organization that focuses on issues for women and girls. Do you see a disparity for these topics / development between youth boys and youth girls?
Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing some gender differences in what works. It's this complex interaction of the ways that girls are unfairly socialized to really be thinking about social relationships as a signal of worth, and the way in which the visual medium kind of interacts with this hyper focus on objectification or physical appearance as a marker of worth among females. The broader society issues and the unfair double standards towards females are the big problem here, but social media might be, playing on some of those vulnerabilities and making matters a little bit worse in some cases. So we are seeing that there is a potential gender difference in some of these effects.
Great. Thank you so much. And I just want to say I'm a mom of a toddler, so I'm wondering when she gets to that adolescent age, what it'll be like in the social media realm.
Yeah.
So thank
For
you.
sure. For sure. Good luck.
Well, we are just about at time. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Prinstein. This was an incredibly valuable conversation. We have so many great questions. So I'm going to hand it over to Jacqueline for our last few minute things. But thank you again for your time. Really, really appreciate it. Great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Sam and Dr. Prinstein, for this very important discussion. Thanks for our audience for joining in, and a lot of engagement with all the questions. So we hope you can join for our next member-only Alliance discussion on September 14th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. The September 30th end of fiscal year 2023 is fast approaching. So we'll have a candid off-the-record conversation with two highly respected Capitol Hill veterans, Cheryl Yeager and Jane Lowenson. Cheryl and Jane have agreed to walk us through the good, the bad, and the ugly as Congress considers issues bearing on the pace, reach, and sustainability of medical and public health progress. My email will be in the chat, and if you are a Research America member and haven't received the registration link, feel free to please email me. So with that, thanks all again, and have a great afternoon.